apologize in advance if I echo a little, but I just accomplished this major dream of purchasing a 1925 Mediterranean revival house, and it's still empty, so it's a little echoey in here. But today, time traveling through wedding tradition.
See, that's my picture. So
Okay.
we'll do that.
Thank you.
Hi, if everyone could mute themselves.
All right.
All right, so just quickly a little bit about who we are. I'm Andrea Knies, and this is my co-founder, Mimi Cirbusova, and we are Compass Rose History Experiences. And we came together over the shared love of local history, and we would be out at happy hours and things like that and start chatting about local history. And we found that two things were happening. One is that people were stopping their conversations and listening to us. And two, they thought we were talking about real people, which was really fun. And we're like, oh no, that person died in 1913, but we still think they're our friend. So it made us realize that there was an interest in this. And so we formed Compass Rose History Experiences to share that love with the community. And you can, if you check out our website, compassrosehistory.com, we have a blog, we have a podcast, we have videos. And once we're able to meet again, we will have more experiences to help you with that connection. And today, you are going to experience a little time travel.
So we're going to start kind of way, way back. We're going to do about 100 years of wedding tradition history, but I want to give you a few things looking way, way back. So, you know, a lot of times when we think about really far off history, a lot of us think of ancient Egypt. So I kind of wanted to start there. And I said, gosh, you know, what did the ancient Egyptians do for weddings? And interestingly enough, there wasn't really anything to do with a wedding ceremony. There was no such thing. Basically, the groom and the bride's father would create an agreement, and the bride and the groom were considered married as soon as the bride moved all of her stuff into the groom's home. So in that situation, you know, my husband and I would have been married like 2 years earlier than we were. But I thought that was a very interesting thing because we think that weddings are something that's been around forever, and they really haven't been. Now, with rings, you'll see this great little graphic here of a posy ring. It's something I got from the British Museum. And, you know, rings have been exchanged for centuries. You've probably heard in my promo video that in ancient Egypt, they did share papyrus rings or exchange papyrus rings. If you were wealthier, you might have something made out of a more precious metal. But really, you know, rings have been around for a long time, but we start to see that in the Renaissance, brides start receiving these posy rings or poem rings because they were inscribed with little messages, and the messages sort of ranged. A lot of times they were pulled from the Bible or pulled from, you know, popular music, but you would see these little poem rings that started to emerge during the Renaissance era. And, you know, some other traditions that we think of, you know, like rice, you know, throwing rice. We think that that's kind of an outdated thing. Well, during the Renaissance, the Italians had a tradition of throwing stones or garbage at couples as they were leaving the, you know, wherever they were getting married, usually the chapel. And there is a suspicion that that tradition actually stemmed from disagreements within families over the dowry. So the dowry agreement would come to an end and it would say, okay, we're, you know, whatever it is, this is, you know, and certain family members didn't always agree. So garbage would sometimes be thrown at the betrothed, which is kind of unfortunate. I'm glad we've changed it to rice or bubbles or some other things that we have now. Now, speaking of throwing things, you'll see in this great image here from the 19th century that, you know, a lot of times in southern France, and I thought this was really interesting, couples were actually pelted with coins, like, ouch. And it is believed that that tradition actually stemmed from the children that were living in the streets. being given sort of permission to go and harass the couple as they were leaving the church. And they were allowed to do that until the groom, essentially paid them to go away and leave them alone. So I have read a few conflicting stories, but a little bit of information out there says that in France, sometimes they still do throw coins from time to time, not as much as they used to, but that was kind of an interesting tradition. So that's a just quick snapshot into the way, way back and some interesting things that I could find for you. But really, Andrea's got to tell you about the wedding of all weddings. I mean, the big one, the one that has set all of the traditions in motion. So Andrea, take it away.
So if we actually had a time machine and we were going to set the date and go back in time to the one date that really created the traditions we know today, we would go back to February 10th, 1840, to the wedding of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. This is actually like on my time travel list when I perfect it, because I think this would be amazing to see. I'm pretty sure we could do an entire presentation just on this wedding, but we are going to try to take you through, another 100 years. So I will keep it brief. But some interesting things about this, the idea of wearing white was not a thing. Queen Victoria wore it for two reasons. One, it was expensive. White fabric was just really expensive. And two, her gown was made of lace, and she thought it looked more beautiful on white. Totally makes sense. Prior to that, royalty usually wore something that had metallic threads, again, to show their wealth. But she also was making a political statement with her dress, because every piece of her dress was made by a local artisan. And she was trying to prove that you didn't need to get your lace from France, because we have wonderful lace makers right here in England. So it was a political statement as well, which is pretty cool. And so, interestingly enough, she had this wedding, it was 1840, and the Victorians are just amazing. And they like to add symbolism to everything that they do, right? So by 1849, only 9 years after this wedding, 9 years, they have in Gaudy's Ladies Book, are publishing that this has been something that's going on from the earliest ages, and that white was an emblem of the purity and innocence of girlhood. So it actually at this time had been going on for 9 years, approximately, but earliest of ages. And it wasn't about the purity and the innocence of girlhood, it was about the fact that white was a very expensive fabric, and it was about the fact that lace looked really nice in white. A couple of other things to keep in mind with this. At this point, they did still wear their dresses again. Even Queen Victoria wore her dress again. It was not uncommon to wear your dress another time. It was almost an expectation. And she also added a crown of orange blossoms, which, keep that in mind, because it's going to come back into play as we continue our time traveling.
Love Queen Victoria. She's got all sorts of great things that we can learn from her weddings. And, as we time travel and go forward, we're going to kind of look at this new century. So skipping ahead a little bit and moving into the new century and a little bit beyond, our dear queen, weddings were a pretty practical thing. They were something that just you had to get done so that you could move on and get to the next chapter of your life. And I found it really interesting when we first started finding newspaper reports and looking at what was in the newspaper. The newspaper, especially locally here in Sarasota and in Florida in general, you don't see a lot of weddings being talked about in the newspaper. So the majority of what we know about our past comes from firsthand accounts or comes from the newspaper articles that we find. So as I was looking, it was seen to me that there was really the only time your wedding would be mentioned is if you were from a family of significance or if someone else of significance attended your wedding. But I found two particular, exceptions that I thought were quite fun and interesting. The first being this a quiet wedding that actually took place at 6 a.m. So on Sunday, the April 3rd in 1910, you have these two particular, young people who decide to get married. Now, C.V.S. Wilson was the owner of the newspaper. He did help officiate the wedding, so therefore it was included in the newspaper. But it was particularly interesting that they had the wedding at 6 a.m. so that they could get on the train, the 6:45 a.m. train, to go to Tampa, where they were going to make their home together. And the other one next to it that I thought was really great was this other one, Bethia and Easterling. And now something you'll see in both of these that I just love is a particular phrase that you see time and time and time again. Oh my gracious gravy me. My favorite phrase when I look at all these wedding announcements is, the news of their marriage was a great surprise to their family and friends. Now, what we can learn about that is, you have to read between the lines when you're looking at these historic newspapers, and you see that over and over and over again, this is mentioned. And typically it's a little tongue-in-cheek way of saying, hey, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we know why they're getting married, but we're not going to say it publicly because that wouldn't be nice. So I love this particular thing. If you try to go back and look at the newspaper articles, you'll see this over and over again. It starts to fall out of fashion as we get further into the century, but this phrase, you can see it throughout time. It's definitely something that I love and appreciate, and it's kind of that almost like a little Easter egg in our newspaper.
Yes. And as we move forward, you'll notice, Mimi's examples are from the Sarasota papers or the Bradenton papers. And we also used a website called floridamemory.com. So even though we're talking about wedding traditions in general and how things were going, we did want to focus a little bit on local history because that's what we do and that's what we love. So these are all from, you'll see on there, most of them are from floridamemory.com. But as we look at this new century and the style of the attire and how that changed, when you think about the Victorians, there were corsets for sure, and then they had really full skirts. But as we moved into this new century, we started to see people doing something a little different at their weddings, and that is dancing. And as people began dancing at weddings, they wanted to be able to move a little bit. So we still have the high neckline because you have to be proper, still have the long sleeves, but the silhouette has slimmed down a lot in this era, and the corsets are now gone, so that these brides are able to celebrate a little bit and party at their reception. Well, party like it's 1910.
So moving into the Roaring 20s and an era that everybody loves to talk about. I mean, we're now in the 20s in 2020, but the Roaring 20s were, an interesting time period for sure. And one of the things that I absolutely loved in looking through all of our newspapers and learning more about what traditions were happening in this particular decade was I kept finding this one ad that I loved and loved and loved. It was from Cole the jeweler, who had a jewelry shop on Main Street in Sarasota. And this is just a clipping from the Sarasota Daily Times. I love it because you can see where somebody hand wrote genuine orange blossom engagement rings and cut it out and then took a clipping out of a catalog from that the jeweler would have received and then pasted it into the newspaper. You definitely don't see this anymore. But I kept wondering to myself, I was like, orange blossom engagement rings, what is that? So I did some more digging and I found that in the 1920s, that orange blossom theme that Queen Victoria again started, that she wore in her hair, that started to be heralded back to during that decade. So you see in the 1920s, the popularity of these orange blossom engagement rings, particularly in the Art Deco designs that would have these really subtle silhouettes and etchings of what they called orange blossom motifs. And I just love that continued to be something that people incorporated because it was considered fashionable and it was considered something as a symbol of innocence and fertility. So, if you wanted to give your beloved a wonderful ring for engagement, you wanted to give them something that would definitely symbolize the same thing as Queen Victoria, innocence and fertility. And I just thought that was such a great, great thing. Wedding rings have changed more and more as we go on in time, but that's something to think about too. And hey, orange blossoms, I'm a big fan.
Right. Gosh, Queen Victoria, I mean, her influence is so amazing. I love the fact that there are things that just continue to pop up through time from that one wedding date. And as Mimi was mentioning, the style of the rings is also very Art Deco. And that style is reflected completely in the wedding attire of that time. And so it's the 20s, things were scandalous, ankles were shown, headlines were raised, all of that was definitely happening. The silhouettes were very straight, usually with a drop waist. Again, back to those clean lines of the Art Deco style of the time. But another thing that was really popular, and I just had to use this picture because Josephine Davis Whedon here has one of the most amazing examples, I believe, that we found are the headpieces. The headpiece was really a big deal in the 20s. And it was similar to, they wore a lot of headpieces in general. And you see it in anything that's 20s themed. You see like either a headband type thing or the cloche hat, which is that hat that's really close to the head and sits a little low. And all of this can be seen in the headpieces for the wedding, the bridal headpieces. And again, these are things, we aren't to the point where people didn't wear their dresses again. Like these people would still repurpose their dresses and they could repurpose that headpiece really easily. I don't know if Josephine could, hers is pretty extravagant, but they could repurpose those headpieces into something that they could use later. And so that was a huge piece to that style and that era of weddings for sure.
And something we haven't quite mentioned yet, in the 20s, you'll see kind of an evolution in the size of the bouquets. I mean, these huge, massive bouquets were quite popular, and you start to see that theme happening in some of the photographs. So I just wanted to mention that too, that, the bouquets were just absolutely enormous. They might as well have been a table piece. They were so, so big.
20s would have been fun. So as we move into the Depression and World War II, obviously things changed drastically. And so there was during these years, people were not, even if it was a dress they intended to wear again, they weren't purchasing a dress again, or a new dress for any occasion, even a wedding. So the idea of purchasing a wedding dress, really, there were some in there, but usually if you find someone wearing a traditional wedding dress at this time, it was someone else's wedding dress in their family that was passed down to them that they were wearing. So they were usually, if they did wear a more traditional style wedding dress, it was usually someone that it had been worn before. And you also, of course, had weddings happening very quickly because as these men were shipping off to war, they were getting married as soon as they could, so that they were married before they left for the war. So what's most traditionally happening during this time is that you have the man in his service uniform, because that was the best outfit he had. And then the women were wearing their best dresses as well. And that commonly at that time was a really beautiful suit. I am Hazel Hankin here. I am absolutely in love with her suit with that detailing on it. But you can see that, they would add a corsage, they would add a little headpiece, but it wasn't about getting something new, creating something new, having a specific dress for your wedding. It was about looking nice and getting married cheaply and quickly. But things were about to change majorly as we get past the war.
So I mentioned my love of, I just dove way deep and got into all of the newspaper wedding announcements, and you see this big boom happening right around the 50s, and it gets more and more popular as we go on into the 60s. And the wedding and engagement section of the newspaper became a thing. Now, that's not quite the case anymore. We don't see that as much as we used to, but newspapers started to get a little wise and realize that they could charge people to put in wedding and engagements announcements. So you see over and over this pretty standard theme that, you see the bride's parents take out an ad. It was very expected that that's what you did, and one of the things that you would do as the mother or father of the bride. And so you would say, your names, and then your daughter's name is going to be wedded to, the young man, and these are his parents. And it followed a very typical structure. So you'll see little notes about, where the bride and groom went to high school, where they're going to college, where they're going to settle down. Sometimes you would see little notes of where they're going to get married, particularly if they were going to get married in a church. But you find some little unusual things here and there, and I just absolutely loved reading these. And the photos, now you might be wondering, well, where are these photos coming from? And because, my goodness, like, tease it to Jesus. But you see these photographs, and these are all the bride's high school graduation photos. So these are usually their senior year photos, their senior year portrait. And so sometimes you would see, these portraits, and they're probably outdated by a year or two. But that was the norm. That was what you wanted to see. And we start noticing more and more, if somebody is, again, of a family of significance, you see a longer article about their wedding, and there's a lot of information about, what songs were sung and who was there, and what colors the bridesmaids wore. It's a lot of detail. But I love the fact that you start to see these full page spreads. And again, most people, just normal everyday people, their name may not ever show up in the newspaper except for their wedding or engagement announcement. And so we learn a lot about just everyday human beings and what was going on at the time in these full page articles. So just an absolute fantastic trend that I kind of wish would come back, because it's just so endearing and so sweet. But yeah, the 50s and the 60s really start to change some things in the wedding industry.
Yes, they do. And a lot changed with the attire during this time as well. So when thinking about an example of the perfect mid-century wedding attire, I looked no further than my own mom and dad. So my mother, obviously, super trendy lady, always was. And now that I'm sitting here, I realize I have that same shine on my forehead as my dad, which is really great. But oh well, I didn't know I had his forehead until right now. But so my parents, my mom was really exemplifying the trends at the time. So she had the full skirt, the tulle. Something else that was really interesting at that time is that you were still expected, when you got into the church, to be totally covered. And so they started adding pieces that you could remove at the reception. So my mother, for hers, yes, she had the sweetheart neckline, but it did have a modesty panel. But she had the long white gloves on. And that way, when they went to the reception afterwards, she was able to remove her gloves and be a little bit more carefree, I say, at the wedding, at the reception, than she was in the church. But other people, the jackets were very popular for that same reason. So you could go into the church and you could be wearing a jacket that covered you up completely, long sleeves, but then that could be something that you could remove when you got to the reception. And another thing that started happening at this time was simply Hollywood. So all of a sudden, people are seeing, and when you think about it, it's almost like Queen Victoria again. Queen Victoria was so well known and recognized that people saw the paintings, or they stood in the street to see her, or she was a celebrity at the time. And so in the 50s and 60s, we had celebrities again, and those celebrities were definitely setting the trends for the wedding attire. And because of that, we also had the ability to buy things off the rack like they didn't really have before. So my mother's dress was made by my Aunt Shirley, because my Aunt Shirley is amazing. But you had that option to buy things off the rack. And now you have these wedding dresses you can buy off the rack. And this is when we finally got to the point of the concept of, I'm going to buy this dress for my wedding, and it's only going to be for my wedding. This is really the first time we saw that. This was not happening until after World War II. So that's a fairly new concept when you think about it. It wasn't, it just wasn't something that could happen. Now, as far as the men go, my parents are from a small town, and my mother's dress was still made. And obviously my dad is wearing his brother's suit. I'm pretty sure that was Uncle Elmer's suit. But, they did the best they can, and they still were really, that was a very typical wedding attire for the 1960s. And I mentioned this idea of the celebrity and what they are doing and the influence they have on the weddings. And it happens to be that Audrey Hepburn got married in the 50s and the 60s. And she gives us a lovely example of both. So you see her first marriage in the 50s, and she definitely has that full skirt and the gloves and very much more of the traditional 50s style. And then we get into the 60s, and we thought things went crazy in the 20s. Oh my goodness. Some of these dresses in the 60s were quite short. I mean, they were wearing mini skirts as wedding dresses by this point, which I think was a very fun thing for them to do, but just strayed greatly from anything that we've seen before in the styles. As you look through, it seemed like things kind of morphed from one style to the other, and you could see the influence that the period before had on the next era. But gosh, the 60s turned it all upside down, and that's when you got things like Audrey Hepburn's adorable little mini dress.
I also wanted to point out here too, you start to see a little bit of moving away from being solely married in the church or being and having a reception there, only. So in the 50s, we start to see a few people, lots of times you would see people who would have their weddings and receptions at a family member's house if it was large enough. And then you start to kind of see, other venues and other places. So typically outdoor spaces, gardens and places like that. But, this is where the venues, especially those of you who work in the venue rental space, this is where you start to see that trend starting to come through, and it gets more and more apparent as we get into the later decades. But that whole idea of, you have to get married in the church, it's just held on pretty strong. But, brides and grooms started to kind of think a little bit differently in the 60s about, do I have to get married in the church? Is there somewhere else that we could be? We think that, it's always been this way. Well, that's not always the case.
Right. I mean, white was always meant to be symbolize purity and innocence, right? It's always that way. We always bought dresses that you wore once for your wedding and never wore again. All of these things were always. But that really, as we take you through this, we do want to address how can you use this information? Of course, we think it's fun to talk about history, and we could do it all day long, but we do think it's important for us to talk a little bit about how you can actually use this information.
Yeah, I mean, right now, obviously, we're all in the midst of this global pandemic, and it's really affected the events industry. And y'all, I am feeling for you. It's definitely affected Compass Rose history experiences for us to be able to, do tours and give people some in-person information and really bring history to life in, face-to-face. But, as you look back in this timeline, you start to see things like the, World War II. That definitely changed the game for weddings. And so we have to think a little creatively about how we use this information, how we look back on history of, well, what is it that people are going to need? I think a lot of folks here, I'm sure on the call today, you all are probably used to doing some pop-up and engagement and different things like events that, are smaller and more catered and kind of all wrapped into one thing. And I think we're going to see more of that. That's sort of my prediction based on the history that we've learned, I think you're going to see a lot more people who want to just go, hey, let's get this done. Let's, I want a full package, just make it all happen. I don't want to think about all these extra details. I think we might see a little bit more of that. I also think we're going to move a little bit further into, couples saying, how can I make this an experience that isn't just about having a big blowout bash, but really make it extra, extra special because, people are distanced from their families. They want to have something that they can bring their family together in a safe way. Something else that I think we might see, again, because of this pandemic, is the way in which we serve food. I think people are going to be extra cautious about that because, and we got to be thoughtful and creative, and how do we do that in a way that's both sustainable for our planet, but also protects our, all of the guests at an event. So there's some things I want you to start thinking about, and we can learn by looking back in history that, if you're ready to jump in and adapt, hey, you can do it.
Another way this could be really helpful is when you have clients who want to have an era-specific wedding. And, Mimi and I are sticklers on making sure that they are accurate with what you're doing in the era. But we do have a secret weapon we use. If you've never used the website vintagedancer.com, she is absolutely incredible. But what she's done is the reason we love her is she goes to primary sources. We are big fans of primary sources when it comes to historical research. And she goes to those primary resources and she has them on her blog, and she really explains what makes something the 20s, what makes it the 30s, what makes something Victorian. And then she also has links if somebody's looking for a vintage piece, or if they're looking for a replica piece that they can use that would be an actual replica. So in addition to that, she's got an amazing link at the top where you can ask her a question. So if you are working with clients, it's a resource that we use as well when we're looking at fashion history, because that is her expertise. And our expertise is really local history. That is what we do. So we always find people who have expertises that we are missing. And that is definitely one that we use, because we think it's important that if someone is trying to use an era as a theme for their wedding, that even if they don't do it completely accurately, it's important that they know what was happening there so that they can make this decision. And it's also important, like Mimi and I were saying earlier, for people to know that these things that we think were going on forever were not. Yeah. So everything changed throughout. We took you on, about 100-year history, and you can see how much changed over 100 years of time. So we have to really think about that when people are worrying and fretting about things and say, oh, but this is how it's always been done. I have to wear white. Well, yeah, Queen Victoria did, but that doesn't mean you have to. So that was really some of the takeaways that Mimi and I had as we were working through this and thinking about this wedding history.
So I think just to, we want to not give you an opportunity to ask some questions. We wanted to keep it very short and sweet for y'all. But, as we were doing our research, some of the things that kept coming up for us is, we started thinking about, what would be most helpful, what would be most interesting. So if anybody has a question or wants to share some ideas or things that you've seen that have worked well, please go ahead and pop it into the chat box. So Stacy asked that to repeat the name of the online resource that we mentioned. That is vintagedancer.com. So I'm going to say that one more time, vintagedancer.com. Great resource. We just love them. Noteworthy local weddings in the past 100 years. I think Andrea might know a couple of these.
Yes, noteworthy local. What's interesting about some of the early local weddings here is that they were all from somewhere else. So a lot of times they would get married back in their hometown and they would come down here for receptions. But one of my absolute favorite local wedding love stories is Owen and Vernona Burns. Owen Burns was a real estate developer. Burns Court is Owen Burns. He at one point owned about 75% of what we now call downtown Sarasota. And Vernona came and was visiting relatives, and they were her cousins. And when she was leaving, he just fell in love with her. And he actually met her at the train station in Sarasota, which was on Lemon and Main, and decided that he was going to go back to New York with her to ask her father for her hand in marriage. And so they did get married in New York, but then they came back and had a wonderful wedding here. And it was everything that I read about it had a lot of green. I don't know why they were wearing a lot of green, but apparently she was wearing this amazing green velvet outfit. And I just love, we don't know that we know he did go to the train station, but in my mind, it's a Nora Ephron movie, and he went to the train station and went running down and jumped on to go with her. We don't know that. We do know that he did go to the train station and she wasn't expecting it. So that was a wonderful one. And then of course you have John and Mabel were married before they got here, but I always think it's really interesting that we don't talk about John Ringling's second wife. But that happened, and that was here. So I think that's an interesting thing, that there's a second wife in there that never gets mentioned, but that definitely was something as well. So those are some of the things when I think about some of the local weddings. Owen and Vernona were just my favorites, but I could go on and on.
So another question that I'm seeing is, one, I had somebody who mentioned in the chat that they incorporate family histories into modern wedding videos, and include comments from grandparents and old photos, which would be so sweet. And then, a question that we had was about popular wedding venues in the past that aren't around anymore or just not used as venues anymore. And I can actually give a little bit about this. So World War II, we did have an Air Force base in Sarasota County, and the municipal auditorium, so that big dome building on the bayfront, that was actually the Army Navy kind of loungy hangout place. And that's where you would go to meet all of your cute little, uniformed men. And so a lot of, couples met there and got married either in the venue or nearby. That was really popular. And then also the Lido Casino. So the Lido Casino was on Lido Beach. It was a beautiful place. And so I'm sure there are quite a few events there, and you could listen to, was it Ed Bundy? Ed Bundy, the orchestra conductor, and he had a big band and played music. And so there are quite some romances that happened out there. But it was a very romantic spot. Sure enough that we had some beautiful celebrities that came through, including America's Mermaid, Esther Williams, who posed in front of the concrete seahorses on the facade. So there's a lot of great venue spots that unfortunately don't exist anymore. But the places that we do have that are historic, they're absolutely spectacular and wonderful. We're very lucky to have them. Has it always been a tradition that the bride and groom don't see each other before the ceremony? No, that's the short answer is no.
Yay. We're photographers. We're photographers, and so sometimes it's really hard with the more traditional brides who go the more traditional. I put in quotations because you're telling us it's not traditional, but that they're no, it's tradition. We really want to do it this way, and it's
that moment.
Yeah, they want to have that moment down the aisle. Yeah. But as photographers, we're you get so much more, and it's so special seeing each other before.
So you will start to see, and a lot of it was the lifting of the veil in cultures where you did not see the bride, where it was just not a thing, particularly in arranged marriages and those specific cultures. But, you know, even with the veil, you know, that was not as much about, you know, purity to begin with. It was more about protecting the bride so that she would be, you know, safe from, you know, usually spirits or other things. So all these things that we consider traditions just aren't, you know, and so the short answer is no, that's not always been the tradition. And I know that, you know, I know for myself, my husband and I did a first look because that, you know, he calms me down. So I needed that. But, you know, anytime you're working with a couple that they go, gosh, you know, my mom says I have to do this thing because it's tradition. You know, if you do a little bit of digging, a little research, you can say, well, actually, no, that's not really the case.
You didn't even touch on the tradition of the engagement ring. And, you know, I actually,
yeah,
I
love the you know, the exchanging of the rings was not a thing. Like, so grooms didn't actually start wearing rings until like the 30s and 40s. Then you start seeing the uptick of what they call the double ring ceremony, which is where they would each exchange rings. Normally, if it was talking about a wedding, if they didn't say a double ring ceremony, only the bride got a ring.
Well, and I actually was fortunate enough, I inherited my grandmother's engagement ring, but they got married in 1923, and engagement rings were not actually a thing. I call it an engagement ring, but that's not really what it was. It was my grandfather giving her a gift, and it is her birthstone, because that's what they did. It wasn't a diamond. If you did give a gift to your betrothed, it was usually their birthstone, not a diamond. So luckily, out of 36 grandkids, I was the only one born in February like my grandma. So I got her ring, which is super cool. But it, you know, like I said, I call it an engagement ring, but that's not even what she called it, because in the 20s, that's not what they were doing with that. It was a gift from my grandpa. And he had to go all the way from southern Indiana to Louisville, Kentucky to get it. So it was a really big deal.
We got another question about rings. So Becky asked about, in Europe, I find that they wear their wedding bands on the right hand and here on the left. Is there any reason that it's different? That's just cultural. It really is. We dug into it, and each culture kind of has their different traditions. And particularly in Jewish communities, you will see more and more that they don't exchange, you know, the bride might wear a ring, but the groom does not, or neither of them might wear a ring. But it's just a cultural tradition, and that whole thought around, well, you know, on the left hand, it's a direct vein that goes into your heart. That idea and that story kind of was something that emerged later, and you start to see it more and more, you know, a little bit later in time. It's something that I could find solid information about. But I don't have a specific reason as to why it's not, besides it's just a cultural thing. Any other great questions or conversation starters? What are your thoughts about black diamonds and black dresses? I mean, I don't know if you're asking my opinion or if you're asking just in wedding tradition. My opinion is I loved my wedding because everything about it was me. And if that's what makes somebody happy, go for it. Like, I don't know anybody who's going to hex you because you were wearing a black dress on your wedding day. I mean, I think, you know, traditionally, again, we go back, Becky got married in a black dress. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has to do what is right for them. And again, you know, traditions are not what we think that they are. And Victoria started the white thing.
Black robes were very traditional for the bride in ancient China. That was something I found when I was digging. So it was black robes, and they usually had white underclothes or something about the black on top of the white that was symbolic. But in ancient China, they wore black robes. So
my mom wore a hot pink dress from a showgirl. She borrowed the dress because my mom was working on the circus at the time, and she got married between shows. So, you know, they went across the street, got their rings, went to the other side of the street, got married, and then got back onto the show. So, I mean, you know, I think this whole thing about traditions, we got to start let people know that traditions are what they are primarily because we make them so, you know? Do we have any other thoughts? Any other? Oh, love you too, Ashley. Thanks. We've got some really great comments in here about people's, you know, traditions and what they've done, and I'm loving all the feedback. You can find, if you want to learn more about us, please visit us at compassrosehistory.com. Follow us on social media at Compass Rose History. You know, Andrea and I are always so excited to do things for Swell. You guys are an amazing group. And thank you to Jordan for always including us. You know, this is not a normal, you know, topic for I think, wedding professionals to talk about, but, you know, I hope that we gave you something to think about, something fresh and new. And it's, hey, it's the evening. I think we're all ready for a cocktail. So, you know, thank you again for joining us and for watching our presentation. This meant a lot to us to be able to share.
Yes, thank you all so much.